This is a recording of Geology 200 and Physics 206 class for November 6th. We will be dealing with Chapter 11, Geologic Time. One of the things that this chapter focuses on is trying to figure out, well, the different methods through which we've tried to figure out how old the Earth was. Because people understood that the Earth was old, but the question really became exactly how old is it? And it's hard to really test exactly how old everything is until we've been able to start doing so using radioactive isotope analysis. But before then, people wanted a way to figure out how old things were. And if they didn't have an exact age, they instead developed geologic timescales that were able to show the sequences of events based on relative dating mechanisms. So most of what's in this chapter is going to consider relative dating mechanisms. It's looking at how old things are in comparison to each other. There are kind of two things we should talk about before we get a little further in this, though. These are two very different ideas of how the Earth changes and also kind of was formed. One is the idea of catastrophism. This is the idea of catastrophe is driving landscape development. So large, unexplained, unplanned for changes kind of appearing out of nowhere are driving this theory. It was developed by James Ussher in the mid 1600s, and he based this on his understanding of the Earth being created in 4004 BC, based on a chronology of history utilizing, in part, biblical genealogies, which for the time period kind of made sense as a way for Christians to consider how, well, and perhaps Jews to consider the age of the Earth. However, when we look at some of the other writings from other ancient human groups, there are, for example, Asian writings that go back almost 12,000 years. So clearly it would have to be older than those people, otherwise their dates and information are wrong. But he based his idea on the Earth going through sudden worldwide or mostly worldwide disasters like global floods as ways that the Earth surface and Earth landforms had changed. We do not, in general, believe that this is the way, however, the Earth has changed. Modern geology holds the idea of uniformitarianism. This is one of the fundamental principles of geology, and it states that the physical, chemical, and biological laws that operate today are the same ones as they were in the past. So the rate of radioactive decay of atoms is the same today as it was thousands of years ago. The biological laws today are the same as they were when life first formed on Earth. With this, people talk about the present being the key to the past. And this principle is going to require that the Earth be quite old and that the processes that happened took a long time to occur. So you don't have catastrophes driving things here, but instead long, gradual processes. I do want to point out that this is not Unitarianism, which is a religious belief system. Uniformitarianism is just dealing with the idea that things are happening at the same rate. It is not a religious or spiritual belief. And before we talk about how old things are, we also need to talk about the concept of time scale. You could all probably, if I asked you to, put events in your life in some sort of an order. And we could even perhaps come up with a time scale for that order. Maybe you would think about one event that happened each year you were in school or each year you were alive or something like that. But if we took all of the events that had happened in your life and instead of having them in any order, just kind of made them random as we listed them on the board, those events might not have a whole lot of meaning. And also it might look strange when we look at things like graduated high school, turned 3, learned to drive a car. Clearly, that's not the order in which things happened. Putting things in perspective and in order is important if you want to try and understand how they happened. And the Earth, we know, is old. It's older than any of us are really capable of imagining or even comprehending. So trying to understand the processes that made the Earth what we see today, it's a really difficult task. And we want to know what shaped it. What made the Grand Canyon the Grand Canyon? Why is there a desert in Maine? Did you know there was a desert in Maine? Why does Africa look the way that it does? Why is Antarctica such a different continent than some of the others? That's going to need to understand the changes that have happened there, but also perspective about the questions you're asking. We'll talk about 2 different types of dates as we go through some of this. There's the numerical dates. These are usually determined by radiometric dating. So carbon-14 is an example of that. Or relative dates. With relative dates, it's putting things in the order in sequence. So what happened first, second, and third. Those are then usually referenced out to a numerical date, but relative dates are putting things in order first. As we go through, there's going to be a number of principles and rules of understanding dating. One of these first, or 4 of these first rules are seen here. We have the law of superposition. And each of these laws, numbered 1 through 4, is represented by 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the bottom, showing you pictures. In the law of superposition, we believe that the oldest rock, according to that law, we believe the oldest rocks are on the bottom of any set of rocks. And this is only going to be true in undeformed sequences of sedimentary rocks or lava flows or volcanic ash or things like that. In this picture, it would mean that looking at profile 1, the green is the oldest, and then yellow, and then orange, and then blue, because they're laid out that way with superposition of the blue being at the top, meaning it is the oldest, green being at the bottom, meaning it's the youngest. This is only going to work if your rocks are undeformed, so if they haven't been changed after they've been laid down. Then we have 2, the principle of original horizontality. That sediments are deposited horizontally. So we believe that layers are going to be deposited horizontally. And that works as long as things are not deformed. But as soon as there's a fold or a fault or an incline that happens after deposition, things can be changed and they may no longer be horizontal. They may be on an angle, they may be vertical, they may even be turned over. But we use this principle to look at the layers where we can see the horizontal structure, and we're able to figure out which is the oldest. Now, when we look at these layers in 2, still the green layer is the youngest. I'm sorry, the green layer is the oldest and the blue layer is the youngest. They are on an angle, but if we looked at how this would have been horizontally, we can see that blue would have been at the top, green at the bottom. And when we combine law of superposition with original horizontality, we're going to get the idea that green is the oldest and blue is the youngest. Another principle that we have is the principle of lateral continuity. That sediment beds originate as continuous layers, extending out in all directions. In 3, you see a kind of way of trying to look at how this would work. In this, you have a river or something that has cut through bedrock and created a canyon. Excuse me. Through this principle, we assume that the yellow rocks on either side of the canyon, the orange rocks on either side of the canyon, and the blue rocks on either side of the canyon, even though they do not touch each other, are of the same parental rock, and that they were formed at the same time. So they're laterally they have lateral continuity, even though they aren't still part of the same rock, but because they were originally part of the same rock. Then we have the principle of cross-cutting relationships. This is the idea that the youngest feature is going to cut over and through the older features. This is usually going to happen after a rock has been formed, and then there'll be some sort of perhaps a volcanic intrusion or something like that that has a new rock layer cutting through older rock layers. In 4, that purple stripe is a younger feature cutting through the older features. So we can then say that our order would have been green, laid down, then yellow, then orange, then blue, and then that purple would be the youngest in that. We're now going to look at some actual examples of these principles. This is showing you the Grand Canyon. And in the Grand Canyon, hopefully you see the idea of superposition. The rocks on the bottom are the oldest, the rocks at the top are the youngest. You can see distinct stripes and colorations as you go as you look throughout the canyon. At the bottom, one of the older rocks of groups is the Supai group. These are sandstone, siltstone, and shale. Then you have the Hermit Shale, the Coconino Sandstone, Toroweap Formation, and the Kaibab Limestone being at the top. These are formed during different time periods, they're formed through different processes, but when you look at them, you can also hopefully see the idea of lateral continuity here. That even though they've been cut through by a river and a canyon's been formed, where we see Coconino Sandstone on one side and on another side, it's still part of the same original layer from the same time period. This one for me was one of the more difficult ones until I saw a picture like this, that idea of original horizontality. These rocks are very, very deformed. They've been pulled, they've been pushed, they've been twisted, they've been folded, but we should not assume that they were formed like this, but that they've been deformed to become this. And then if we were to kind of try to pull everything apart and lay it out flat, we would know that the ones that were, or once we looked at their original horizontal structures, we'd be able to figure out who the oldest and the youngest were. Now, hopefully you can see my mouse. If not, if you can see the yellow grouping of flowers, go down from the biggest yellow grouping of flowers, go down to the next smaller yellow grouping of flowers, and then down a little bit more, you get to what looks like the center of that fold, of the big fold of these rocks. Those rocks would have been under that center fold. They are likely to have been the original rocks of this layer. And the ones near the top then are younger rocks that as they folded, some of even the middle-aged rocks got exposed at the surface because of how things folded and were deformed. This is another cartoon looking at lateral continuity. So you can see here that we had our sediments formed and that there were different layers that formed over different time periods. Water came in and created a canyon. And this principle is telling you that the yellow on one side is part of the yellow on the other side. Same is true for the orange and the beige and the green layers, and also that red little layer. So by saying that that these layers would have continued and thus they're part of the same age structure, helps us to figure out how this was created. This is showing you cross-cutting relationships. And instead of this showing an intrusion, what it's showing is a fault line. So cross-cutting relationships can happen dealing with intrusions, but they can also happen with faults that shift the rock layers. The fault must have happened after all of these layers were put together. It has just changed things, and you can then attempt to piece back together what things would have looked like and the order in which they would have formed, knowing that the fault would have happened after all of these structures had been laid down, or at least after all of the structures that it cuts through had been laid down. Any things that are flat on top of it afterwards would have actually happened after the fault. This is another example of the cross-cutting relationships where we have dike structures cutting through rock structures. These dikes are going to be younger than the rock structures that they cut through. Our next principle and rule is dealing with inclusions. So when you have inclusions, you have one rock contained within another. The principle of inclusions tells us that the rock must have been there in the first place for the inclusion to have happened. So the inclusion rock is younger than the rock that it has formed inside of. Xenoliths occur when the original rock does not melt, but stays as rock during the intrusion event. In this picture, you can see that there was an igneous intrusion into the orange igneous intrusion into the green rock structures. That igneous intrusion is going to be younger than the green rock, and those green rocks that are inside of the igneous intrusion are going to be xenoliths. There may be also inclusions inside of the rock above it. In the sedimentary layers, we see some igneous and some green inclusions in there. And they were deposited from elsewhere, moved into this area and deposited after the weathering process. We're going to be doing a lot of these rules and principles today. Kind of sorry for that. The next is the idea of unconformities. Unconformities deal with breaks in the rock record. Perhaps we should start by talking about conformities. Conformities occur when rocks have been deposited without any interruption. We have layer 1 with 2 on top of it, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, so forth. An unconformity is when that is not going to be the way that things are actually seen by you, that layering structure has been somehow altered. In an unconformity, deposition might have stopped. Maybe the erosion rate was high, or there was some other significant geologic event in Earth's history that changed the way that the rock structure was created. There are 3 types of unconformities. The first is angular unconformity, when you have tilted rocks that are overlain by flat-lying rocks. So rocks have been deposited, some sort of a fold or a deformation happened with erosion, and then more rocks ended up on top of that layer. We have a disconformity. This occurs when there's a gap in time in which erosion has happened and there hasn't really been deposition. You end up with a span for which there is kind of no record. There may be strata on either side that are parallel, but disconformities can be difficult to identify and really hard to examine well. We'll look at a couple good examples of that in a moment. Then we have nonconformities. Nonconformities require uplift because what happens is metamorphic or igneous rocks are brought to the surface, and there may be younger sedimentary rocks with them, but erosion is going to lead to these very differently aged rocks being in close proximity to each other. This is showing you how an angular unconformity can form. So deposition happens, and then over time there's some uplift, some folding of your rock layers. Through the process of erosion, this folded kind of hill-like structure has been eroded down to a flat surface, and then new deposition has happened on top of it. That angular unconformity, that line, is where that new deposition happened. But it's deposition on top of an eroded, folded, deformed surface. So there will be these different layers kind of mixing in. And if you look at the numbers on here, you can see layers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 6 is that angular unconformity. And then 7, 8, and 9 were laid down on top through deposition processes. This is looking at an actual picture of an angular unconformity. They have a rock hammer in there for size, so you have an idea of how big these rocks are. And you can see that the rocks are actually running in different directions. Not only are they different colors, but these rocks are running in different directions that they were laid down. And they will have different different compositions. The rocks beneath are made of sandstone and shale, and the rocks at the top are a different sandstone, a reddish sandstone, and conglomerate. So they have different identities, they were laid down differently, and since then they've actually even been moved a little bit. This is looking at a disconformity. So a disconformity is going to be a gap in the record. This is a time period where there's been erosion, no deposition, and maybe some other things have happened. These can be really difficult to identify because at first it may just look like, well, there was a little bit of erosion and then this layer happened. But it's not that there was a little bit of erosion. There could have been a lot of erosion. These are usually helped to figure out by looking at other information, whether it's fossil assemblages, radioactive dating, perhaps pollen grains, or other things that help us to figure out that there was a large span in time here. And not just that layer beneath the disconformity and the one above it were not adjacent to each other in time. Here we have a non-conformity. Non-conformities require some uplift in order to get the metamorphic and igneous rocks to the surface so that they're capable of eroding, and then these other layers are going to happen on top of them. So in this non-conformity, there was uplift and erosion that brought the igneous and metamorphic rocks to the surface so that they were eroded. And then sedimentary rocks were formed on top of those following the erosion. There may be xenolith structures that are going to be involved in this, and you can see those there. So here we have, once again, our Grand Canyon. It's a great example before, and it's a great example again, because it is full of unconformities. There are disconformities. There are nonconformities, angular unconformities. There is some intrusions. There's a lot that has happened to make the Grand Canyon what it is. And if we look at all of the rocks in it and we understand them better, we're able to piece apart how exactly did this form and what were the processes that may have been happening while it formed. This picture has it labeled alphabetically, the geologic history of what would have happened here. When we do the lab for this portion, you're actually going to need to be figuring out some information like this. And I'm going to walk you through this one, so hopefully you can figure it out with me. So layer A is our oldest layer. It should have originally been horizontal, and then it would have had B, C, D, and E on top of it. F would have then cut through A, B, C, D, and E. But then we see that because F doesn't continue, there must have been some type of angular unconformity. And then the layers above that are G, H, I, J, and K that have formed normally. There was some uplift, some angular unconformities. It appears to be some intrusions in here. And you can tell that these rock layers have changed from the way they were originally laid down horizontally. So this doesn't hold to that idea of the rocks being, to put the rock layers back in order, you need to figure out when they would have been horizontal and look at all the laws to figure out the order in which things happened. And actually, you can work out exactly how this happened, and that's what the textbook has done for you. Layers A, B, C, and D were all deposited. following the law of superposition. I'm sorry, A, B, C, and E. One of the things I said on the last slide is that A, B, C, D, and E were all together. However, if you caught it, what we see in D are intrusions of both layers C and E. If D contains portions of C and E, D must have formed after E. So now we have an order that is A, B, C, E, D. After that, we have an intrusion of the dike, layer F. And then there is some uplifting and some erosion, and we get our angular unconformity. And then layers G, H, I, J, and K were laid down. So our order is A, B, C, E, D, F, G, H, I, J, K. So hopefully one of the things that you saw from looking at this is we can match rock layers to figure out the order in which they would have happened, even across something like a canyon. But we can also match rocks of similar ages in different regions. We may not be able to do this as easily as saying, oh, look, these are the same rock. Sometimes we can, though. But we may use fossils in order to do this well. The study of fossils is the field of paleontology. And if you, which all of you have, taken biology classes, then you would know that over time, life has evolved. Different life forms have existed during different time periods, each adapted to their own time. But when we find fossils, it tells us about what was alive during that time period, and it can also give us information about the climate of that time period. It allows us to then make inferences or hypotheses about past environmental conditions. We can also use fossils as time indicators, as our fossil organisms were only around for distinct time periods that we can sometimes date using radiometric dating mechanisms. So what exactly are fossils? They are remains or traces of prehistoric life. So these are either things left behind or things that we can use to try, that we can use to figure out what life was like. And this life is dead, it is gone, but we're able to piece together what life was like when those things were in fact alive. There's lots of different types of fossils. There's the obvious things like teeth and bones and shells, utensils and other things, arrowheads that we find. Then we can deal with permineralization or petrified substances or materials. This happens when the cavities and the pore spaces in it are filled with precipitated mineral matter. The minerals will precipitate and fill the pores and empty spaces. They're generally going to fill them with silica, and this will turn those structures then into stone. You can also have fossils who form by replacement, where cellular material and mineral matter are going to switch ions and things so that you're going from bone to rock in the switching or the replacement of the chemical constituents in the matter. You can also have molds where a shell or some other structure is buried and then it's slowly dissolved by underground water and it leaves a mold of itself or an impression of itself in the solid rock. Or you can have a cast, which occurs when that hollow space of a mold is later filled with mineral matter that then hardens into a rock. Your textbook gives a little bit more information and background on each of these types. I may not give you a whole lot much more background because I'm starting to lose my voice some, but we're going to continue with one more slide on fossil types. There's carbonization. Carbonization occurs when the organic matter becomes a thin residue of carbon. So you're left with just an imprint of, almost like a pencil imprint in carbon on a rock. This happens when materials are encased by fine sediments during deposition, and then pressure eventually squeezes these rock layers together. In doing so, it squeezes out all of the liquid and all of the other matter, and what is left behind is that residue of carbon layer. We have impressions, where there is a replica of the fossil surface preserved in the fine-grained sediment. Think like footprints. There's preservation in amber, which is the hardened resin of ancient trees. It usually will include insects, and this is the main way that insects fossilize. One of the things that we've most recently been looking at in amber is the fossilization of ancient heathers. There's also indirect evidence, tracks, footprints, burrows, coprolites, which are fossilized dung and stomach contents, and then gastroliths. Gastroliths are stones that were kept in the stomachs of some extinct reptiles. Birds today actually keep gravel in their stomachs. Birds don't have teeth, and some of the ancient reptiles did not have teeth or did not have good teeth. And these gastroliths allowed them in their muscular stomach to grind up their food, particularly to grind up the bones of the animals they were eating. Birds use gravel in their stomachs to do very similar things today. Here we see some of the different types of fossils. So there's in A, a picture of petrified wood, which still does look like wood, even though it has become petrified by the addition of silica into its pore spaces. In B, you see both the mold and the cast of a trilobite. In C, a fossilized bee was preserved as carbon film. D, showing impressions with great detail of fossilized fishes. E, showing a spider fossilized in amber. And F, showing fossilized dung. And while it would be nice if everything was fossilized, that doesn't really happen. Truthfully, only a very small percentage of life is really going to be fossilized, because most remains are normally destroyed in one means or another. They may be eaten. They're frequently broken down by bacteria. And it is rare that things are not broken down by bacteria or eaten. So some remains are fossilized. This will only happen in conditions that favor preservation, or if you want to think here of that word of preservation being fossilization. It happens in areas, generally speaking, with rapid burial. So where things are going to be covered by mud or sand or another type of substance very quickly. This will allow the soft parts that would normally be eaten away by bacteria to fossilize. Hard parts generally fossilize well, because flesh decays really quickly and soft parts do too. So hard parts tend to fossilize better than soft things, which means that our fossil record is biased towards things that have hard parts and things that buried rapidly. This is showing you more about the Grand Canyon, but also Zion National Park and Bryce Canyon National Park. All of these are part of the Colorado Plateau. And in this picture, what you're seeing is using one of these structures to kind of help us gain more information about not only the Grand Canyon itself, but a fuller understanding of the geologic history of this portion of the United States. So we are able to correlate some of these structures to each other. Excuse me. There are some of the Kaibab limestone and Monokaipai Formation that are found in both Grand Canyon as well as Zion. And then we see the Navajo Sandstone, the Carmel Formation as part of both Zion and Bryce Canyon National Parks. And when we see this correlation that these rock layers are in fact the same, it does tell us a relative age and gives us information about how we could piece these together in building the history of Earth. Fossils are frequently used for correlations too, so not just rocks. Correlation is the matching of rocks and fossils of similar ages found in different regions, sometimes regions right next to each other, sometimes, particularly if we're dealing with ocean fossils, very different regions. Rocks of similar ages are going to match up. Fossils of similar ages should match up. And this is going to require us to get lots of information from different places to get a full picture about the geologic time period. This leads us to yet another principle, the principle of fossil succession. Fossils succeed one another in a definite and determinable order. This means that fossils are not haphazardly distributed. Old fossils are always old. Newer fossils are always newer in the fossil record. The fossils themselves correlate to specific time periods, not just random ones. So anywhere we find T-Rex bones are going to have to be somewhere around the same time period because T-Rex was not alive forever. He was only alive for a short geologic period of time. And periods can be recognized by their fossils. Fossils can then document the evolution of life and be used as a proxy for time. This idea was actually proposed by William Smith in the late 1700s to the early 1800s. We see this used very widely with marine sediments because marine sediments really do contain lots of tiny fossils that can be used to figure out where the portions of the seafloor were at different times. But marine fossils are frequently uplifted on top of continents and can tell us what areas used to be an ocean. And it can help us figure out past climate information as well. So here we see an example of using the ages of rocks or using fossils to determine the ages of rocks. So if we know that certain fossils are found in rock A and certain are found in rock B, those that are found in both must have been around during the same time period, but those that are found in one or the other, well, that means we need to figure out exactly where they were alive. So the trilobite is only found in B. The shell, the fern, the starfish, they were found in all of them. And then we have the leaf and the skull. They were found only in the top. So that tells us that the leaf and the skull, they have to be much younger than the trilobite, and that the others were around for a long period of time. And in this, you see another fossil that's used for that whole time period. That's a likely one that, well, we'll talk about what that fossil was in a moment. It is an index fossil. Index fossils are those that are widespread geographically, and they usually existed for a short range of geologic time. It's rare to find them that existed for a long period of geologic time. So you can use an index fossil to figure out when things happen, but frequently we use fossil assemblages. Assemblages are a group of fossils that you use to figure out the age of something. But we can also use environmental indicators. When we look at clamshells, we find clamshells in limestone sometimes with thick shells and some with thin. Well, why might a clamshell have thick shells? Well, we find today that those that grow in intertidal zones with a lot of wave action have to have thick shells, whereas those that grow in deep, calm, offshore waters have thin shells. So we can actually use the fossils to figure out something about the environment that the animal lived in while it was alive. This brings us to something you've probably been waiting for in this lecture, the idea of radioactivity and radiometric dating. We're going to review some things that you probably learned probably in middle school with this, and some things we talked about already earlier this semester. So hopefully you remember that atomic structure deals with a nucleus that contains protons, which are positively charged, and neutrons, which are neutrally charged. And that the protons and the electrons are going to offset each other for charge. The nucleus contains protons and neutrons only. The electrons are going to exist in shells orbiting the nucleus. Great. Hopefully you remember that the atomic number is the element's identifying number. It is the number of protons in the atom's nucleus. The mass number is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons in the nucleus. Excuse me. And an isotope is going to have a different mass number, but the same atomic number. Isotopes are variants of the same parent atom. They contain either more or fewer neutrons than the normal isotope. I want you to think for a moment of some examples of isotopes. Well, hopefully you thought about carbon-12 being standard, and then there's carbon-14. You might have thought about hydrogen-2 and 3. You might have thought about nitrogen isotopes, oxygen isotopes, uranium isotopes. Radioactivity is going to deal with isotopes. Radioactivity is the spontaneous break apart or the decay of atomic nuclei. Radioactive decay happens when an unstable isotope breaks down to create more stable isotopes. That unstable isotope is the parent. The daughter products are the isotopes that form from decay of the parent. And there's usually a long pattern of radioactive decay that will result eventually into a more stable daughter product. Not everything in this breakdown pathway is going to be stable, though. There's 3 types of radioactive decay I'm going to mention. The first is alpha emission. This occurs when an alpha particle containing 2 protons and 2 neutrons is emitted from the nucleus. When alpha emission happens, the mass number loses 4 and the atomic number goes down 2 because that alpha particle with the 2 protons and the 2 neutrons is ejected from the nucleus. Beta emission happens when a beta, also called an electron, is given off by the nucleus. The mass number does not change. The atomic number actually goes up 1 because one of the neutrons switches to become a proton due to the lost electron. In electron capture, the electron is captured by the nucleus. It combines it with a proton to make a neutron. The mass number does not change, but the atomic number goes down 1 because a proton has just become a neutron. In case you're thinking, wait, this is so not normal chemistry, you're right. This is not the normal chemistry that you learned. So let's look at these 3 types of decay in pictures. So we have them here. In that alpha emission, you are losing that alpha particle. In beta, you are losing an electron and a neutron is becoming a proton. And in electron capture, you're gaining an electron and a proton is becoming a neutron. In other words, everything's changing. We are looking here at the decay series of uranium-238. Uranium-238 is the parent. It's going to go through alpha emission down to thorium-234, which is going to go through beta emission to Pa-234 back to uranium-234, which then goes through alpha emission down to thorium-230, and so forth until we get to the end to lead-206. That Pb-206 is the eventual daughter of the uranium-238. Radiometric dating relies on the fact that apologies there for all the coughing. So radiometric dating relies on this concept of a radiometric clock. This is that isotopes are going to decay on a predictable pattern by a predictable amount. This is the concept of half-life. The half-life is the time for 1/2 of the radioactive nuclide to decay. Decay rates have been precisely measured, and they do not vary under physical conditions that exist in the Earth's outer layers. They may, in fact, so these decay rates do not vary under the physical conditions that exist on Earth's outer layers. However, we can't guarantee that they wouldn't be different in the core or something like that, because the core is under very different circumstances than the crust and the upper mantle. So these decays require a closed system. This means that decay happens at a fixed rate following the formation of a rock, and the products of decay are going to accumulate inside of that rock. For using carbon-14 to date human remains, the date is going to start at the date of death, because you're still exchanging carbon-14 with the atmosphere as long as you're alive. You don't have a stable amount until you're dead, and then it's equal to what's in the atmosphere. And because they're a closed system, that means that you don't want to be losing either the parents or the daughters, that rock is going to not be, it's not saying that erosion won't happen, but that erosion process isn't going to selectively just remove daughters or parents' nuclei from this. Cross checks are used for accuracy. These cross checks are frequently other types of radiometric dating that can be added in to check to see if one is giving you the exact right answer. And we can actually use them kind of, not to see if they're giving the right answer as much as to see if they're giving the same answer. So you can use different types of radiometric dating. You can also then look at the rocks things are found in, the fossil assemblages and things like that, to check your data. It's a pretty complex procedure. And unlike our other things we've talked about so far, it's going to yield a numerical date, even though it's going to have some range of uncertainty with it. The range of uncertainty is much smaller than the numerical date that you're going to give. But not every isotope is useful for everything. They're only going to be useful for time periods that kind of relate to their half-lives. We'll see a little bit more about that, I believe, in 2 slides. This is looking at that concept of decay curve, looking at the half-lives. And so your daughter and parent atoms, half of your parents at each time are decaying to the daughters during a half-life. So after 1 half-life, you started out with 100, you'd have 50 daughters and 50 parents after 1 half-life. After 2 half-lives, you'd have 75 daughters and 25 parents, and so on and so forth. Eventually, you'd be close to having no parents, or you'd have no parents at all if all of the half-lives have gone out. But not every isotope is good for dating everything. This is showing you a table of different isotopes that are good for dating different structures. Uranium-238 to lead-206 is good at dating things that are about 4.5 billion years old. It's not going to work well for things that happened in the last couple thousand years, so you won't use it for that. Uranium-235 is up there. Potassium-40 to argon-40 can be used to date rocks younger than 100,000 years, which is actually really good because potassium is abundant in feldspars and micas, helping us understand a lot of recent things. Carbon-14, however, has a much shorter half-life than any of these. Carbon-14 has a half-life of only 5,730 years. It can be used to date recent events, and it can date things well up to about 70,000 years. After that point in time, it's not very reliable because the parents are basically all gone. Carbon-14 is produced in the upper atmosphere. It is incorporated into carbon dioxide, and living matter absorbs it, and it can become part of our tissue. But it is always replaced in living matter while you're alive by the lighter carbon-12. But once an organism dies and starts to decay, the carbon-14 that's in it, that is what's stuck in it. So as it then ages after it's dead, and as it decays, the carbon-14 is going to go through its half-life cycle, but it is not going to be replaced by carbon-12. We can then use the amount of carbon-14 relative to its daughters to figure out how old something is. It's a useful tool for anthropologists, archaeologists, historians, and geologists studying recent Earth history events. The man who discovered it is named William Libby, and he discovered really its application and won a Nobel Prize for his work. That indicates that scientists all over the world thought that this was revolutionary, groundbreaking, and trustworthy work. Some of you may have heard that radiometric dating is not reliable. I don't know how much you've studied it, and I doubt any of you have taken courses that focused solely on isotope chemistry, which I have done. And these radiometric pathways are very well constrained. We've studied them a lot in the lab, and while we may not have been able to study things for 4.5 billion years, we've been able to see how things work enough to start to piece together how these work, and we're able to, in the lab, see decay specifically of some of the shorter half-life materials. And I'm going to apologize, I have a cough drop in my mouth, so if you're hearing weird noises on the recording, that's probably why. This is showing you the production of carbon-14 and the decay of carbon-14. Nitrogen-14 is what is going to become carbon-14, and then carbon-14 is actually going to decay back to nitrogen-14. But carbon, I should mention, nitrogen-14 only becomes carbon-14 in production in the upper atmosphere. That's not going to happen inside of your body. It's going to need UV light and all sorts of other things in order for this to happen. Our last topic is, and I'm only going to briefly mention it here because we'll talk more about this in chapter 12, our geologic timescales. The geologic timescale divides geologic history into specific time units. These were originally created using relative dates. Since then, we've gone back with numeric numbers to add on to them. And there are very well-defined subdivisions. Our biggest subdivision is the concept of the eon, their greatest period of time. There are 4 eons. The Phanerozoic is the one that we live in now, meaning, and it can be translated to meaning visible life. It's our most recent eon that we're a part of. The Proterozoic is kind of before life. That was the one before this. The Archean before that, and the Hadean before that. The Precambrian then is the Proterozoic, Archean, and Hadean time periods with kind of like a big heading over them. They occurred for about 4 billion years, and the Phanerozoic has been occurring for the last 500 million. I've mentioned this in one of my other classes. I may have mentioned it to you all, but that word Hadean actually comes from the idea of Hades from your mythology. If you remember the concept of Hades being hell, that it was a fiery lake. And we believe that's what Earth was like during that time period. So it was called the Hadean time period. We can then subdivide eons into eras. For the Phanerozoic, they are the Cenozoic, where we are right now, the Mesozoic, and the Paleozoic. Eras are later subdivided into periods. Periods are subdivided into epochs. The Cenozoic has 7 epochs, whereas the Mesozoic and Paleozoic have early, middle, and late. The people in charge of this geologic timescale are the International Commission on Stratigraphy. They figure out what names and dates are official for this timescale. It has changed a little bit, particularly as we uncover more information about fossil assemblages and actual numeric dates for things. This is showing you the geologic timescale here with the names of the different time periods as well as the ages with them. So we are alive during the Phanerozoic, during the Cenozoic, and within the Cenozoic, we're part of the Quaternary period, and we're in the Holocene epoch. There are some difficulties in dating this time scale, though. Not all rocks are datable. We can't determine a date for every rock. Particularly sedimentary rocks are difficult, because you might remember that sedimentary rocks are formed by the consolidation of sediments. So the date of a sedimentary rock is going to be based on all of the different dates of all of the different sediments inside of that rock. So sedimentary rocks are not used for dating for numbers, but they are used for relative dating. In order to date a rock well, all of the minerals in it must have formed, solidified, at the same time. Metamorphic rocks are going to contain dates from their metamorphic stages, but also from the things inside of them. In general, igneous rocks are used for determining exact dates, but really rocks are going to be used to bracket events and to help us figure out the different ages. This is trying to apply here numerical dates to the sedimentary strata, once again back at our Grand Canyon. And on Thursday, we have our test. We'll pick up with chapter 12 next Tuesday, and then we'll have an activity dealing with chapters 11 and 12 next Thursday. Thank you so much.